Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to our journey through the strange lore of the USA. Today we're covering stories ranging from an unidentified helicopter that in the 1970s repeatedly landed at a US Air Force base that might not have been a helicopter after all, to strange stories about a man in Maine's past that would hunt for gold in a very untraditional way. If it's weird, and it happened in Maine, I'm aiming to cover it here. Now, if you want to see more like this, I urge you to subscribe, like the video, and comment. I always respond to early commenters, and it tells YouTube, hey, this guy's alright. With that, great seeing you here, and let's get into Maine's weird folklore. If you're privy with modern UFO lore, you'll know well that right now it's an undebatable fact that the Pentagon itself, under multiple administrations, has acknowledged that there are strange aerial phenomena being observed over US airspace the world across. From fast-moving pill-shaped craft that seemingly defy the known ability of aircraft to maneuver off of our coasts, to seemingly cloaked balloon or jellyfish-like craft observed and acknowledged by the military in the Middle East. These new craft are kind of scary, but a story that should be held in this light is that of a strange, unidentified craft that was observed multiple times in 1975 over Loring Air Force Base, a base that, until the 1990s, was the largest Air Force base in America in terms of the amount of nuclear weaponry kept on base, right in the northeastern corner of Maine, across the Canadian border. The story I'm about to share with you is not far-fetched, and the details I'm gathering are pretty much entirely from airmen and other members of the U.S. Armed Forces who were stationed on base during this incident, as well as the military's mouth themselves through formal reporting. To set the scene for you, this base, as I said, was home to many nuclear warheads, and this took place, again, as I said, in 1975, in the midst of the Cold War. Further, this base was home to nuclear-armed B-52 bombers and KC-135 airborne refueling tankers. And we've talked about this a lot before, but these craft were tasked with ongoing nuclear alert missions. To put it simply, this was a Cold War-era program, where nuclear-armed U.S. Air Force bombers were kept airborne and would fly strategic routes over the Arctic, Greenland, and the Mediterranean to provide a guaranteed nuclear second strike capability against the Soviets as a deterrent. This base was the easternmost base involved in this activity in the USA, and thus it was one of the most critical in the event of an actual nuclear crisis. Further, about 2.5 miles to the northeast, there were nuclear weapons stored in dirt camouflage bunkers, locations that were heavily patrolled by the 42nd Security Police Squadron, extra munitions that many of the on-base personnel and many of the police guarding them didn't even know about. All these folks knew was that what they were guarding was very important, though I'm sure they did have their suspicions. And with this backdrop, we are taken to October 27th of 1975, when this all ramped up. On this day, security personnel on site would observe an, I quote, unidentified helicopter, which would appear from Canadian airspace on the north end of the Air Force Base, and would then hover on site, with folks claiming it appeared to have some sort of strobe light and a red navigational light. It was about 150 feet above the ground, and most sources I've read suggest that the on-site personnel thought it was observing the nuclear weapons storage area. Now, the military did respond. They'd scramble some National Guard helicopters, but these copters wouldn't make contact, so the base remained on high alert. Meanwhile, in Loring's control tower, via radar, they would see evidence of another unknown craft about 10 to 13 miles to the northeast, a craft that they also weren't able to contact, which would then vanish again over Canadian airspace. This would be the end of the October 27th event, but this event pales in comparison to what would go on the following day. On October 28th, this so-called helicopter would return, and it would do so in dramatic fashion. This night, the notable sightings began with the accounts of Sergeant Clifton Blakesley and Staff Sergeant William Long. These two were part of the 42nd Security Police Squadron, and they were assigned to watch over the munitions storage area. Around 7:45 to 8:20 p.m., these two would note that they saw the running lights of an aircraft at what they estimated was 3,000 feet in altitude. Now, they didn't see a helicopter, but due to its velocity and movement pattern, that's what they assumed it was. This assumption would quickly be challenged, though, the craft would disappear from their view and then reappear over the runway just minutes later, hovering at about 150 feet in altitude without any lights. It would then disappear and reappear again over the munitions storage area minutes after that. Further, it would be spotted by two others, Stephen Eichner and Sergeant Jones, two B-52 bomber mechanics, who observed it over the north runway and described the craft as moving in jerky motions and appearing like a stretched-out football that hovered in midair. They'd actually hop in a jeep and drive towards this craft, losing sight of it for a while before observing it to light up just a few hundred feet in front of them while hovering 5 feet above the ground. In this account, they noted it was about 4 car lengths long, and while I don't think drugs were involved, their account would otherwise make you wonder if they were. They said, "The object looked like all the colors were blending together. As if you were looking at a desert scene. You see waves of heat rising off the desert floor. This is what I saw. There were these waves in front of the object, and all of the colors were blending together. The object was solid, and we could not hear any noise coming from it." Then they would note that there were no doors, no windows, no propellers, no engines, or really, again, as I said, any noise coming from the craft. Now, after seeing this, they also saw security coming their way, but despite the fact that they were in a restricted part of the base, security paid them no mind and went straight after the craft. That said, according to these two mechanics, their being in a restricted part of the base is why they didn't report their encounter sooner. The craft would then leave, being observed over Canadian airspace before leaving them alone for the rest of the evening. During this ordeal, I should note, again, National Guard helicopters would approach the craft. But just like the night before, despite this craft being, seen from the ground, they couldn't visually confirm it. This is despite the fact that ground teams could observe the unlit helicopter and the National Guard helicopter simultaneously. So, while this craft did return on October 29th too, and I think also the 30th, I should note the accounts I'm reading regarding these nights were just more of the same, but you already get the picture of these visits. To sum it up, so-called helicopter infiltrates U.S. military base over and over, and nobody can do a thing about it. Also, the helicopter doesn't make any noise, and looks like a football. Cool stuff. But what I think is more interesting than sharing more details about the visits to you is the reaction of the actual government and military authorities to this supposed helicopter. The most interesting detail, to me at least, comes from Arthur Beers, another serviceman located on site, who reported that he was initially actually given orders to shoot the craft down, but that at the last minute right before he did this, these orders were communicated to and refuted by the literal President of the United States at the time, Gerald Ford, who was briefed on the matter and decided, no, we should not shoot these things down. Further, this article noted that the Joint Chiefs of Staff received briefings on the incursions too. Now, this detail, if true, is extremely interesting to me. To start, there's at least one credible source related to the military out there that simply states that, I quote, "I talked with a general officer who said that the president had been briefed." So I think I am led to believe that Gerald Ford was actually briefed on these encounters. That said, I can't say for certain whether it was his order not to shoot down the craft or someone else's, but this detail does semi-pass the fact check. Regardless though, the fact that somebody didn't want to attack this craft is interesting to me in its own right, no matter who gave the order. If you go back to the 90s, for instance, in March of 1970, Native American activists scaled Fort Lawton's fences, and soldiers were sent to remove them from the base. And also there were plenty of anti-Vietnam War demonstrations at military posts in the 1970s, which military police were more than happy to use force against. So why on earth do folks identified as civilians get arrested and apprehended, but a supposed mysterious helicopter observing our nuclear capabilities gets a pass? It makes you wonder if President Ford or somebody else was worried about who they might upset and what they might be able to do to us if we shot down this craft or even indicated we wanted to. Now, I did read some sources, including ones that were in my covering weird stuff genre, that put forward that this very well may just be that the military was worried about this being a Canadian or civilian helicopter, and that they didn't want to shoot it down because of that. But my 2 cents is, by golly, you have a helicopter right next to our nuclear warheads. I'm not even a violent person. I'm generally not into this sort of thing, but this is absolutely a scenario where you can and probably should apprehend whatever is in your airspace. To me, if you are a foreign nation or a civilian above this area, this is the most inappropriate place for you to be flying, period. So this is extremely confusing to me. Further, in the decades since this event, people that were documented to have been on base have come forward with interesting admissions. For instance, one Michael Wallace, an ex-KC-135 tanker pilot that was stationed at Loring, would say that rather than displaying lights, this craft was just luminous, and that it was able to move unconventionally, with, I quote, straight vertical movements, turning without any radius in its turn, and moving very quickly. Stuff that might remind you of a little video named Go Fast, recently released by the Pentagon. Further, he says that the staff were explicitly instructed to say to the press that this was a Canadian helicopter crossing the border and harassing them. There were also some official comments released that stated that sightings suggested this was a helicopter, but that wasn't certain, meaning that there was some doubt as to whether this aircraft actually was, even in official documents, a helicopter. And that was released when this saga was ongoing, or at least it was passed around internally by the military. Wallace also gave an interesting account of one time when he was on a mission piloting a KC-135 to support some F-4 Phantoms, some fighter bombers, when suddenly he was notified by base to switch radio frequencies, and the front KC-135 was instructed to depart the formation, turn off its lights, go radio silent, and proceed to Loring, I quote, under its own discretion, a really unusual and, dare I say, apprehensive order. He noted that the pilots felt stressed during this episode, and that, of course, nobody was able to see the craft from the air. And finally, I came across an account from one John Morkovich, who served at Loring from 1972 to 1975. This story starts at the Loring Officers Club, a social club or lounge for military officers, sort of a mix between a bar, restaurant, and community center, located on or near a military base. And here, some folks were chatting about one of these October events, when one of the hospital corpsmen and a doctor, again these are military doctors essentially, would ask some pilots about the ongoings at the base. And after a bit of prodding, they'd essentially recount that this UFO, or helicopter, appeared out of nowhere, both visually and on radar, and just minutes after the aircraft were scrambled to intercept it, it was just gone. And then radar showed it very far away and at a very high altitude, literal seconds after it had been on base. The pilots suggested that nothing they knew of on this planet was capable of what they observed. Again, this is I saw XYZ at a bar hearsay, but it does come from relatively reliable sources if it's true. During this ordeal, word was also shared with other nearby bases near the US-Canadian border, such as Pease Air Force Base, Plattsburgh Air Force Base, and more. And in the fall of 1975, there were also spiritually similar, though less dramatic, episodes the country across. For instance, on October 30th, a similar event occurred at Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan, a now decommissioned base, where over Lake Huron, a tanker would observe a so-called helicopter, would lose sight of it, and then, over the base, they'd observe two reported helicopters flying low, and that as they made their getaway, they'd simultaneously turn off their lights, I quote, as if on signal. So anyhow, not to be sensationalist, but this is probably the most interesting and compelling case of a UFO I've ever read, largely because we have a handful of airmen who testified that something fantastical was going on, and there are government-released sources backing it up. That said, in my opinion, even going off of government-released documents alone, these craft seem to have been only reported as helicopters because when they could actually be seen moving, they were moving at about the same altitude and velocity as a helicopter. Every physical description of this craft, however, feels off, and also their ability to evade detection, operate without noise, and seemingly dart from one place to another in the blink of an eye doesn't seem very helicopter-like to me. So maybe I'm just getting fooled by some good old Cold War era gamemanship played by the Soviets, or maybe even the Canadians, for whatever reason, but for my 2 cents, these events feel more in line with the strange modern phenomena we've been witnessing today, and I personally think something weird might have been going on back in 1975. In the woods of Maine, you'll find some lore about someone special tucked away. A story I've told before back when this channel was really small that hardly anybody watched, so I think I should tell it again. This story is about a man who successfully escaped society, and in the meantime became a figment of local folklore, and he gained the moniker the North Pond Hermit. It's a strange tale, and one that makes you sort of wonder why exactly you're rooting for a serial thief and trespasser. And strangely, it makes you wonder if this man was somehow justified in his actions, and if you shouldn't be required to play by the rules and be a part of society if you don't want to be. This story starts with a man named Christopher Thomas Knight, who was born on December 7th of 1965 in Maine. Knight was a shy individual, and not just normal shy. He was shy to the point of finding interacting with others intimidating. For the record, that isn't bad, it's just who he was, and despite this, he was by all accounts very intelligent, if a bit eccentric. After graduating from Lawrence High School in Fairfield, Maine in 1984, he went on to study electronics at Sylvania Technical School, and then afterwards he took a job installing alarms in homes in Waltham, Massachusetts, a small town that's essentially a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. Knight's family was fine too. They weren't rich or anything, but by his own admission, he had good parents, and a good, if stoic, relationship with them. His family was quite eccentric though, and at most nights, when families would be, gathered around a TV watching football or something, his family would read poetry and Shakespeare together. They also fixed their own automobiles, knew plumbing, and for some reason, studied thermodynamics together. They even built a greenhouse, burying hundreds of gallons of water underneath it. In short, they did this because at night, water molecules would release their heat, enabling them to grow their food all winter long in Maine without electricity heating the greenhouse. If you can't tell, they were different, and not in a bad way. They were clearly extremely intelligent and resourceful, and they were also, by some neighbors' accounts, a bit reclusive, so maybe this was just in Christopher's DNA. That said, Christopher's life would change on a whim, when at the age of 20, in 1986, he decided to go for a drive back up to Maine, near his hometown. At around the point when his car was out of gas, he just stopped his car by a trail, threw his keys on the dashboard, and took a walk into the woods that, as far as he was concerned, was meant to last the rest of his life. Modern accounts tell that Knight didn't even know the date that he left. All he knew was that it was around the time that the Chernobyl reactor incident occurred in 1986. Additionally, it doesn't really seem like he took time to prepare for this permanent venture into the woods, as his account suggests that right after he left into the woods, he sort of moved around without a plan at first, bouncing from one place to another until he found his iconic site, where he stayed for the long haul. This would be referred to as Knight's Camp. This camp where he lived is interesting too in its own right. It was located on private property, so it was trespassing, and it was fairly close to hundreds of cabins, a town, and dirt roads. By one account, it was just a 3-minute, or about a 600-meter walk to the nearest residence. I mention this because when you think of this case, you often think that this man didn't see other humans for nearly 3 decades, so he must have been really deep into the woods. But that's clearly not the case, and in actuality, he was in the middle of society, albeit a more rural one. And this begs the question, how did he not get caught? Well, this is partially due to the fact that this part of the forest he was in was extremely thick. It was filled with boulders and disorienting. According to one article about this case, the journalist even thought it would be too difficult for a deer to get back to his campsite. And while attempting to get to the site himself, the journalist cut his hands and ripped up his hiking shoes. The campsite itself has been described as, I quote, a magical room in the middle of the forest, hidden by a Stonehenge of boulders with a perfectly flat floor. And I should note, this flat floor wasn't natural. He'd actually bound together National Geographic magazines he read over time and buried them under the soil to flatten out the ground. As I said, this guy was really resourceful. Also helping Knight's case was the fact that he took great care not to be spotted, and not to stand out. Knight avoided building fires with wood, and instead stole propane to melt snow to drink, bathe, and cook. So therefore, there was never any snow indicating his location. He also made sure to steal supplies, to keep his hair cut, and to keep himself clean-shaven, making him look approximately normal, and not necessarily standing out in the few instances where he was spotted. When he did leave camp to steal supplies, he'd do so in the middle of the night, often walking or canoeing to other campsites in the summer so he didn't have to contend with the elements, and more importantly, so he didn't risk leaving footsteps in the snow leading back to his camp. Also, when he stole propane, he'd transport these propane cylinders back to his camp via canoes that he borrowed from camps nearby, and he would paddle back to camp with them before dawn. He'd conceal these canoes when he returned to them by putting pine needles all over them to make it look like nobody had used the canoe in some time. Further, you might be thinking, didn't anybody miss this guy? And as sad as it is, the answer is yes but no. His parents actually did miss him, but they never reported him missing. Not that they didn't worry about him, they just had the feeling that if he ran off, they weren't going to stop him. To put it succinctly, Knight had a bit of a perfect storm. He knew how to hide, and nobody was ever looking for him in the first place. This perfect storm didn't mean he was off scot-free, though. Knight was living in the wilderness of Maine, after all, a place with winters that are about as rough as they get in the USA. In the dead of winter, in Maine, it's not unusual for the low temperature to be around -25 Fahrenheit or -32 Celsius. To counter this, and to prevent freezing inside of a sleeping bag, Knight would wake up when the temperature was at the coldest, probably unintentionally sometimes, at about 2 to 3 a.m., and he'd walk laps around his campsite while he melted and boiled snow with his propane stove, drinking the hot water to keep warm as he walked around to warm up his body. There were times, though, where even this strategy wasn't quite enough. In one quote, Knight remarked, "When it gets below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when you have religion, and when you pray for warmth." Apparently, there were even some winters where Knight had run out of food and propane, and according to him, these were the times that he suffered, I quote, "physical, emotional, and psychological pain, even contemplating leaving the woods for good, or leaving this world for good sometimes." He once even stole a whistle, just in case he found himself needing help. Now, the winter, of course, did eventually end every year, and according to Knight, when he heard chickadees, or small North American birds, singing, he knew each year that he'd made it through the worst of the season, and that happier times were probably ahead. And it's actually pretty pleasant to read how Knight spent these happier times. Knight reported he'd spend his free time reading, and he enjoyed reading so much that he'd pretty much steal anything he could read when he robbed homes. Over the 27 years he was in the woods, it was estimated that he might have stolen over 1,000 books. He'd also steal radios and headphones, hiding the antenna for radios in trees, and he'd listen to talk radio and music. And apparently, of all of the music he listened to, he had an affinity for Leonard Skinner the most, even remarking in one interview that people would still be listening to them in 1,000 years, a sentiment I can't help but agree with. In addition to music, he also found handheld video games while burgling, and while the articles I read didn't go into details, he apparently spent a bit of time playing games like Tetris, Dig Dug, and even Pokemon. Denny, I'd love to hear your guess on who his starter was. Also, I guess one interesting benefit to his seclusion is that over the course of these 27 years, he never once got sick. According to him, you have to have contact with other people to get sick, and as far as we can tell, he's telling the truth about not seeing anyone for the most part. There were actually only 3 admissions by Knight of him seeing anyone. One was in 1990, when at one point Knight walked by a guy on a trail, and he said hi. That was it. There was also a break-in in 2012 when Knight slipped into someone's house because there wasn't a car parked there. But it turns out, people being home and cars being home aren't mutually exclusive, so Knight got yelled out of the house. His camp was also discovered by a fisherman in 2013, but lucky for Knight, this fisherman respected Knight's wishes of being left alone and never told on him. Now, things appeared to be going pretty well for Knight. He was able to steal necessities and even some luxuries, and was clearly well equipped for the task of hiding away from society. But this didn't mean that his thievery was going unnoticed. During Knight's time in the woods, he committed over 40 burglaries a year, over 1,000 in total. And while these break-ins were never destructive or violent, he was still stealing from people, even if he did lock the door behind him when he left. But theft is theft. It didn't go unnoticed, nor was it appreciated. The community began to pass around a local legend that these burglaries were due to someone living in the woods, someone that, before Knight was even known, was called the North Pond Hermit. Some people he burgled from even left out notes for him, pleading with him not to break in, and they'd just give him supplies if he needed stuff, but he never heeded these. Eventually, though, after more than 1,000 burglaries, the local game warden in the area decided enough was enough, and that there had to be something or someone behind this anomaly. It was just too persistent, and the crimes were too consistent. Further, the game warden had followed the case his entire career, so he probably took some form of personal offense to the fact that an individual was able to evade him after all of these years. Because of this, he commissioned high-tech surveillance equipment, installing it around the area and in commonly burgled spots. See, it was a cool night in March of 2013 in Rome, Maine, when Knight broke into one of his common spots to get food, the Pine Tree Camp, a camp for disabled youth and adults. A motion detector caught Knight, setting off silent alarms, and notified the game warden, who caught Knight in the act at 1:30 in the morning. Apparently, for a minute, the warden actually doubted whether Knight was even a thief, because Knight was apparently very neat-looking and tidy, with clean clothes and a clean-shaven face, and he wasn't even jumpy. But regardless, the warden apprehended him, and eventually Knight was sent to jail in Augusta, being sentenced to serve 7 months in jail and paying $2,000 in restitution to victims, to get counseling, and to do community service, almost like he was ordered by a court to rejoin society. And as for the reason we know this story at all, that's because Knight's story captured the attention of one author, Michael Finkel, who eventually wrote a book about Knight called The Stranger in the Woods. He had interviewed Knight, and it was in these interviews that we've come to learn basically all of what we know about Knight. In short, through these interviews, we learned that Knight, while a thief, was a pretty sympathetic person. By Knight's own admission, he wasn't proud of his theft, even remarking that people have a right to be angry at him, and that he took no pleasure in theft and wanted it over as quickly as possible. He was also asked about literature, and if he kept a journal or considered his similarities to others who had taken similar walks of life, to which he responded, "I expected to die out there. Who would read my journal? You? I'd rather take my story to my grave." Also, as I said, when compared to similar folks from the past, specifically Henry David Thoreau, he seemed displeased. Generally, Knight felt that Henry David Thoreau went out into the wild to show off, and wasn't committed to the life that Knight was, only experimenting, living in the wilderness for 2 years. I quote, "Thoreau's mom still did his laundry," which is factual. When it came to Knight's sentencing for his crimes, even the prosecutor said that he felt like a long sentence would have been cruel, and he was unlikely to reoffend. It was clear to everyone, and it's probably even clear to us as outside readers, Knight felt guilt about his theft, but theft was a worthwhile price to pay for him for his freedom from a society which he was clearly lukewarm about at best. And this leaves us where we are today, with a fairly uneventful ending to the life of Knight, the North Pond Hermit, and the beginning of Knight, the quiet member of society. Knight eventually got a job with his brothers, working for them in exchange for room and board, and I also saw accounts that he involves himself in community service and regularly volunteers and helps out his family where he can. And that's it. Just like that, the North Pond Hermit gave up on his remarkable life in the woods. So it's sort of difficult for me to find a proper ending to the story. On one hand, this story reminds me a bit of the happy ending or alternative to Into the Wild, where Knight genuinely got all he wanted or needed out of his experiment and lived as a free man longer than perhaps anyone in the modern USA, experiencing a life that many talk about, including me, but could never actually dream of paying the price for. In a way, I can't help but feel bad for Knight. Making him join society again is like domesticating a wild animal. It just feels wrong. On one hand, sure, theft is bad for society, but there's also a tiny piece of me that feels happiness to see a man like Knight get to live the life he wanted. With that, first I ask you, what do you think of Knight? Are you glad he rejoined society, or was he a menace? Or do you wish people like him had a legal opportunity to leave society behind with few consequences? And second, I'll end the story with this. In one of his interviews, Knight was asked what he felt was the meaning of life, and Knight responded, "To get enough sleep." There's a thing I think I've noticed, and a lot of other people have across the United States, about cities named Portland. They're pretty weird. Portland, Maine, and Oregon, though, are what come to the front of my mind when I think of weird Portlands. So I thought it only appropriate that I talk about something especially strange that is called Portland home. A man referred to as the Whistler, who was so downright annoying to the city that they invented a new law simply to curb his behavior. So this Whistler, in reality, is a man named Robert, who, for the sake of not doxing a guy that I don't really think did anything wrong, I won't share the last name or face of in this video. Robert, though, is, or at least was back in the 2010s, an extremely controversial character in the city. So as for how this started, Robert once literally shared his whistling origin story to a news outlet, stating that his, I quote, "passion for whistling began one day in his 20s. Before this day, he'd walk around singing songs that were playing on his headphones. But one day, he whistled while listening to some of his favorite music, and in his words, he thought to himself that it sounded pretty cool, and from then on, he began to just whistle all the time, sometimes to the sound of the music he was playing, but other times, more often, to no particular tune at all. And during his non-working hours, he would do this all over Portland's downtown, so long as the weather permitted. And, well, the thing is, while this doesn't sound so nefarious, I mean it literally when I say Robert whistled nonstop all over town, and it wasn't even always whistling a tune. Here, for instance, is a short clip of this loud, obtrusive whistling that just seems random. And he'd do this everywhere, whistling inside, whistling outside, and loudly whistling while loitering outside of businesses, annoying their customers and staff in a manner that could be heard from blocks away. Ultimately, this behavior would actually get him picked up by cops. Now, the exact details of this are sparse, but my impression is that one day, or maybe multiple days, he would loiter in front of the Starbucks in downtown Portland. And of course it was a Starbucks that called the police on him. And he would ultimately be told to stop, which he'd refuse. And lo and behold, he would be arrested for disorderly conduct. Robert's response to this was sort of interesting too. He'd say, "You can arrest me 1,000 times, and the day I walk out of this jail, I'll be whistling out the door." And in response to his persistent whistling after this, a city ordinance was actually even passed, listing whistling as disorderly behavior and fining any offender up to $500. And the loophole here for Robert, well, they compromised and said that he was welcome to whistle so long as he was moving. Thus, Robert remained the whistler, but he had to do so while in motion, while walking down the street. Now, before we move on, let's get some stuff straight. I saw speculation that this man's behavior was perhaps the consequence of substances, or something more nefarious, like whistling indicating that he was selling things that were very illegal. But there is no evidence of this. The man just seemed to love whistling because it brought him joy, maybe to a compulsive degree, mind you. Anyhow, as for the end of this story, it's a bit vague. I found folks mention that Robert one day just sort of stopped whistling or that it gradually tapered off. Today, folks actually still report to see Robert around town, and even a few months ago, I saw mention on a Portland, Maine forum that he was seen around town riding his bicycle, not whistling at all. Anyhow, that's the story of the strange Whistler saga in downtown Portland, Maine. Now, in my digging through some old newsprints looking for stories, I saw whispers of a story that may or may not exist, and then looking for that story, I stumbled upon something beautiful. An article published on January 28th of 1898 titled "The Mysterious Hermit Who Buys Poultry," and then I knew this was going to be good. This story begins with a man named Simon Carey, who the newsprint would refer to as the first and only man in St. John Valley that would place hen farming upon a paying basis, noting that others who had tried to perform hen farming didn't make any money from the practice, which perhaps is why this was so interesting to them. Simon himself, you see, was also an interesting individual locally. He wasn't one of the locals, really. He didn't really even live in Maine, rather living just over the Canadian border in Perth Andover, but he frequently crossed the river in an old dugout canoe to do his shopping in Maine. Further, Simon would do something interesting when he came into town. Every single time, he'd buy some number of hens, usually just 3 or 4, but sometimes as many as a dozen, which wouldn't have been noticed really, but the locals also noted that it was strange that for someone who bought so many chickens, he never ever sold poultry or eggs. And over time, this made people wonder what exactly he was doing out in his cabin. Thus, on New Year's Day, when Simon would buy 10 hens and roosters, it would be the last straw, and locals would actually stealthily follow him home. A party of 3 would follow him, and from the woods they would observe Simon standing by the door of his cabin as he watched his hens scratching and pecking at the ground over a large area where the snow, which elsewhere was 2 feet deep this time of the year, was cleared so that the Simons could peck right at the ground unobstructed. And then, in front of God and everybody, Simon would raise his rifle and smack one of them upside the head, knocking it out before slicing its crop open, a little pocket where chickens store food and whatever else they eat, removing its contents, and then going inside. The men at this point had enough of this strangeness and they wanted answers, and so instead of waiting around any longer, they'd essentially bust into Simon's home, where they'd have an interesting exchange. The men would essentially say, "Bro, what on earth are you doing?" To which Simon would reply, "This is my land and this is my business." And then kindly, one of the men would point out that this cabin was actually resting on his land, and Simon therefore was a trespasser. Now, Simon was smart, and therefore he would relent at this point, and he would give the men the juicy details of what was going on. This is the story that Simon told these men. Simon, you see, had moved down to this region just because, I quote, he'd seen better days up north, and the climate no longer agreed with him, and one day he just left. And then he said when he was a kid he loved eggs, and thus to this day he kept chickens as companions that supplied him eggs and sort of kept him company. But then it dawned on him, it had been a hot 4 or so decades since he'd eaten chicken, and despite these chickens being his company, sort of his friends, he decided he'd eat one for dinner. That said, as he cleaned the chicken he was about to eat for dinner, he wondered to himself what on earth they were eating. He never saw them do anything but pluck at dirt and gravel, so as he cleaned the chicken, he cut open its crop. And he'd be amazed that instead of finding bugs and junk it picked up, he'd find, get this, soft but shiny yellow particles, which he thought might have been gold. And then he'd actually dream the following night about being a gold proprietor. And get this, the following morning in the hen house he found, I quote, a pile of shining particles, which I take to mean he found a pile of chicken poop that was flecked with gold. Now, I don't exactly know how he got here, but apparently he collected a pocket of this gold by sifting through chicken poop, I suppose, and he'd bring it to Fort Fairfield in Maine, showing an envelope of this poop gold to a jeweler, who would confirm his suspicions that this was gold his chickens were dukeying out, and that right in front of him in this envelope was about $1.50 worth of it, or about $60 worth of gold in modern day. Thus, Simon would go on to buy hundreds of hens, at first just doing away with them after collecting gold from their crops, but later learning to perform a simple surgery on them, essentially where he'd knock them out cold like the men saw, collect the contents of their crop, and then sew them back up afterwards, and after a couple weeks they'd be right as rain, and this surgery would save the chicken's life, while he could still collect his gold, and over the time he did this, he collected 4,256 grains of pure gold, which would earn him the modern equivalent of about $7,000 over just 6 months. Now, sadly, we don't get to hear where this ends, which leads me to believe that he didn't become some sort of chicken and gold farming empire, but this strange story, which is possibly true but possibly folklore, ends, suggesting that Simon planned to expand his operation, building a proper chicken coop, before the newspaper leaves this story behind and fades into telling the weather. Hey folks, just a quick interjection. I hope you're doing well, and quickly I wanted to jump in and let you know this video is sponsored by nobody. It's sponsored by me. And if you want to see more like this, you can help me out for free by liking this video, subscribing, and commenting on it. If you do that, you'll get access to all of my stories and notifications when they're out, and you'll also get notified when I go live, which I'm planning to do weekly. And we'll talk about fun stuff from live storytelling to more. Anyhow, that's the call to action. Back to the video. So if you watch this channel, you know sometimes I've included cryptids in the weird videos, and other times I've made solo cryptid videos. But you know what? For Maine, I'm gonna meet in the middle and include one cryptid story. And if I see enough support, I'll do a full bonus video soon covering all the other cryptids in Maine. So tell me down below if you want to see that. Anyways, for Maine, this one's a doozy. It's the story of the Palmyra Werewolves, one of the strangest and most widely retold modern werewolf cases in the USA. This story centers around the Martin family, who in 2005 was working in a mill in Maine when he injured his back reaching up to a shelf, slipping a few discs, and losing his ability to work. Luckily, his wife had her health, and she, named Shelley, found a job back in her hometown of Palmyra, in a rural town of about 1,200 people, that from my impression is best known for potato fields and thick swaths of wood. Thus, they'd move there, to the chagrin of their son and daughter. Now, not that hurting your back is ever good, but moving to Palmyra did have its perks, principally in the form of cheap land, and thus Eric and Shelley would find a large, quiet property off of Madawaska Road, a home with a barn a bit to the left of its entrance, a large gravel driveway, and a big stretch of open field in front of it that led straight into a dense forest. To be quite clear, this sounds a lot like my dream property, but sadly this place, that to so many that would be heaven, ended up becoming their own personal hell one night. So, quick aside, Eric was a lifelong hunter, and actually had a collection of rifles, but Shelley, given they had kids, didn't want them locked up in the home, pushing him to put the rifles in their barn. I think you can see one part of this story that's gonna end badly. This aside, they'd enjoy their new quiet property in Palmyra, even developing a tradition of going outside and drinking coffee on their porch every night before bed, which I guess these two hated sleeping, but that's what they did. This peace, though, wouldn't last forever. For instance, in early 2006, Shelley, while they were indulging in this coffee ritual, saw a weird light pulsating and coming from the forest at the edge of the field on their property, where there was no road beyond it. Eric saw this too, and actually assumed it was a poacher, calling their son Sean to go to the woods with him to check it out. And together they marched towards the woods, shouting that it was private property, and as they did so, the light seemed to sort of fade away and vanish. Then just after this, they heard something big moving nearby, crunching through the brush, and intelligently, the two went back inside. Now, they weren't sure what they encountered this day, whether it was a poacher or an animal or both, but they kind of put this aside in their mind, thinking nothing of it afterwards. And for about a month or so after this, they wouldn't notice anything off again. But that would change a month or so later, on an unspecified date, when the family daughter and her boyfriend would go for a walk towards the woods, taking the family dogs with them. The dogs would do what dogs do in the woods, though. They would dart ahead after a squirrel or something, so the two would chase after them. And they'd find the dogs, together, stopped outside of what looked like some sort of hole or den in the ground. A mound of leaves, sticks, and moss, with a big hole in the middle. And the two swore they heard something growling inside of it. So they got out of there and they told Eric and Shelley, who strangely enough remarked that they'd also heard growling when they were near the wood line earlier that month. And that would be their last warning sign about what they claimed was about to rock their proverbial world. To set the scene for you, it's Labor Day weekend of 2007 now. It was a misty night, and it was quite silent. And Eric and Shelley were doing their thing. They were drinking coffee on the porch. Now, on this night, Eric was a little bit freaked out already, but he couldn't explain why that was. Shelley even teased him for being jumpy this evening. But then, Shelley would freeze. She heard something. She'd scan the field ahead with a flashlight, and she'd catch the glow of 3 sets of eyes in the mist staring at her. They were supposedly yellowish-green, didn't seem to have pupils, and they were high up, as if whatever these were, they were standing. Then, the Martins watched in disbelief as 3 tall wolf-like shapes stepped closer to the house. Each one was about 7 to 8 feet tall, with short brown fur, short tails, and long pointed ears that started at their jaws and extended past the top of their heads. Eric, a seasoned hunter who could tell a wolf from a coyote, had no idea what he was looking at, given I have to imagine most of the creatures he hunted weren't bipedal. Then, as they scanned the yard with their eyes, they observed 2 more creatures appear from the side of the field, flanking them, 5 in total, all standing upright on their wolf-like hind legs. The couple, of course, did what you and I would do. They ran inside and they locked their door. Eric floated the idea of going to the barn and getting his guns from the barn, which isn't the worst idea ever, but Shelley said hell no, and instead they took the approach of turning off all the lights and peeking at the creatures through the blinds. The creatures, strangely enough, were still there, but they weren't prowling the property anymore. They were sitting in the gravel driveway, lined up, staring at the home as if waiting for permission to enter. And while this was going on, Shelley actually went to look for their dogs, fearing they left them outside, and found them luckily hiding together in the master bedroom. Regardless, as she did this, Eric noticed the creatures went back out to the fields beyond the house, and he decided that he'd try to make a break for their car because of this, and that he'd drive it up to the porch so the family could pile in and they could make a getaway. Thus, he grabbed his keys and made a break for the car as fast as a man with a back problem could. But halfway there, the motion light on his house snapped on, flooding the yard with a bright white light. Eric froze, and he looked out towards the fields. He noticed that the creatures had noticed him, and thus, like a proper horror movie protagonist, Eric would fumble and drop his keys, having to give up on his plan of grabbing the car and instead making a break for the home, getting into the front door just as he heard the creatures' claws doing tippy-tappies on their wooden porch behind him. At this point, the family claims they called the police too, but the police seemed unimpressed with the 5 werewolves on my lawn story, telling the Martins that this was probably a bear, or maybe something similar, and they should just stay inside. So instead of insisting they get help, they just accepted that they were going to die, I guess. Thus, they'd barricade themselves in their master bedroom with their daughter and son, who had previously been asleep, and all night they heard pacing outside, and also claws on the roof of their home, which, by the way, was 2-tiered, so they could see shadows of these creatures walking right past their second-floor window as they walked on their roof. And then, just before sunrise, there was silence. The creatures would promptly leave before the sun came up, and come morning, they'd inspect the property, finding deep gouges in the doors, claw marks on the siding, and huge canid footprints in the dirt, which were 8 or 9 inches long with hooked toes. Further, they found a bit of fur clung to their wooden porch in some places. The Martin family, of course, would sell this property and move out soon after this. And as for how we came to hear this story, well, they told the story to a local writer, Daniel Green, who included it in his publication Shadows in the Woods, a chronicle of Bigfoot in Maine, which was made popular when the Sci-Fi Channel dramatized it in their show Paranormal Witness on the episode Wolfpack, which the family, to their credit, noted was a very dramatized version of the story told in Daniel Green's book. So, with the story out of the way, let's quickly step back in and question what evidence is there that this actually happened? Well, I have sort of bad news here. Not that this is definitively saying it didn't happen, but there are no photos, no videos, no physical evidence, no neighbors to corroborate the story, and no police report. This story comes basically entirely from the Martin family's recollection and through retellings such as its TV and podcast appearances. Not to be bleak, but that alone isn't the best supporting evidence, and it makes me wish for more if I were to take this story seriously. Further, I'm not trying to be rude, but I've contacted the police a number of times, and when there's ever been a hint of something dangerous like this happening, they didn't just leave me hanging. It doesn't matter if this was in Boston, Massachusetts, or Jackson, Tennessee, small town or large, they never showed up quickly, but they always sent someone out to talk to me. I personally find it a little bit tough to believe that if you said your property was under siege by pretty much anything, that the police wouldn't send out a squad car eventually if you were insistent. Further, not many people bring this up, but these weird wolf creatures weren't the only thing this family said was on their property. Eric also claimed that prior to this incident, he and his wife had seen, I quote, a little ghost girl inside of his home, and some sources say he told neighbors about this too, which... Now, I don't know what to make of this entirely, but it kind of makes me wonder if Eric had a wild imagination, and if he might have been spitballing and seeing what story stuck. That said, in favor of this story, what I will say is that a lot of people go down the road of this was probably a pack of feral dogs or bears angle, which, yes, Maine has a lot of wildlife, including feral dogs and bears, but I can't, in my right mind, humor this explanation either. As, yes, bears stand up, but the way a bear walks is nowhere near how these creatures were described. And personally, I've never met a dog that walks on 2 legs, let alone 5 in a row. So anyhow, let me know what you think. Was this story of the Palmyra Werewolves a true account of dogman or werewolf-like creatures in Maine, or was this family full of it? Bucksport, Maine is a small coastal Maine town that for the most part isn't a big fuss. It's tucked along the Penobscot River, and it looks across the water at Maine's Fort Knox, not the one that stores gold for the record. In terms of landmarks, it's a little north of Acadia National Park too, a place where I might end up making a Dark Places video somewhat soon. Now, as you might be thinking, Bucksport is an interesting name, and indeed it is. That's because it's named for one Colonel Jonathan Buck. Now, Buck himself was born in Massachusetts in 1719, and he would eventually make it up to the wild frontier territory that was Maine, actually founding a settlement along the Penobscot River that would eventually bear his name, Bucksport. Here he was a militia colonel and a mill owner, sort of your prototypical all-purpose early New England figure, who ran the show locally and supported constructing everything from sawmills to shipping yards, turning what was basically a patch of wilderness into a working town. That being said, this industrious nature isn't what Colonel Buck is most known for. In actuality, his claim to fame, or infamy perhaps, comes from a legend surrounding his death. See, in life, some say that Colonel Buck, due to his local position, would sentence a woman to death for witchcraft. Some say she was actually burned at the stake, but, as often happens in these stories, as she passed on, she would utter one more word, a curse towards Colonel Buck, vowing that she'd, I quote, dance on his grave forever. That said, after this, Buck's life would otherwise go on without a hitch, nothing particularly bad would happen, and then, like the rest of us, he'd simply pass away on March 18th of 1795 at the age of 76. As far as I could dig up, he simply died from something relatively normal. Nothing menacing was noted about his passing, and then he'd be buried in Bucksport Cemetery, and eventually over time a notable obelisk that stands in the cemetery today was erected as a memorial by his descendants in the mid to late 1800s. Again, not that it really matters, but note, this obelisk was built later, and Colonel Buck's actual grave is in another part of the cemetery. Despite the seeming finality of this story, though, something interesting would happen to old Buck's grave. It wasn't vandalism or anything, but rather a dark mark that sort of resembles a woman's leg or a stockinged foot would appear on the obelisk as a dark stain. Now, at first, folks just tried to remove this stain, but even after removing it successfully multiple times, the stain just kept coming back, and thus locals have settled that this imprint of a foot on Buck's grave as the old witch that Colonel Buck had burned, keeping her promise to dance on his grave for all eternity. So, I should note, there are variations to this tale, as it is folklore after all. In some versions he had her hung, in another version she was burned, but at the end of the night, right before she went quiet, her leg would actually, this is gross, it fell off and it rolled out, stopping at Buck's feet, as a precursor to this stain. Further, she wasn't a witch in some versions at all, but rather a woman that he got pregnant with his child, despite the fact that he wasn't married to her, and thus, keeping her alive would have been a bad look for Buck. Either way you slice it though, this leg imprint is the woman's revenge. So today, in Bucksport Cemetery, you can come out to rural Maine and observe this slice of maniac history and folklore yourself. And perhaps, if you believe the ghost stories that they say linger in this cemetery, you can even talk to the witch yourself and see if those skeptics saying this mark is simply weathering on the stone over time are correct. Yep, we're covering another UFO now, but fret not, this story is quite a bit different from the earlier one. This story isn't about aliens conducting subterfuge, but it's rather a classic story of potential abduction that happened in the eerie stillness that is Maine's northern portion. This story involved brothers Jack and Jim Weiner, and yes, I encourage you to laugh at their last names, in addition to their friends Charlie Foltz and Chuck Rack. These four were students at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and this summer they decided to trek up north to the Allagash wilderness, sadly unrelated to Allagash Brewery, for a couple of weeks of camping and fishing along the Allagash Waterway. This area they'd be staying in is super remote. For example, they didn't drive here, or even take a bus. They were dropped off here by a bush plane. And if you're dropped off by a bush plane, you know this is extra remote. And this was something they had to plan about a year in advance, as they had to book this plane well ahead of time. Here, they were looking forward to a long stretch of time, tucked away from society at the confluence of peaceful rivers and streams. Despite this, though, they weren't totally alone out here. On their first day out in the wilderness, they'd actually bump into a few others, and these others would be intimately involved in how this story shaped. See, on their first night, when they'd otherwise have been sitting around their campfire, they were hailed by their fellow campers, because one of the teens in their group became separated from them. Thus, the boys would grab their binoculars and begin sort of scanning the area for signs of this lost boy. Well, that was until they noticed something sort of strange in the sky, a light. This light was bright, and to the east, moving ever so slightly. Initially, they actually thought it was Mars because it had a reddish hue, but it was just too bright, and seemingly too close by to be a celestial object. In fact, it seemed like it might have been only a couple of 100 feet over the tree line. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it seemed to blink out of sight. At this point, my impression is that they'd all kind of go, well, that was weird, and they'd find the kid they were looking for and go their separate ways from the other group for good. No matter though, they thought little of this, and they'd settle into camp and make a large fire on the shore of the lake. And just after this, they'd decide they'd quickly take a nice summer paddle in a canoe out into the lake. At first, my impression is this really was peaceful. Out here away from civilization, it was probably incredibly dark, and by their account, it was equally quiet. This peace would be broken though. Chuck, you see, was paddling on the river and then felt that unmistakable feeling of being watched. Thus, he'd kind of look over his shoulder and he'd realize that weird ball of light was back. It was just as large as before, if not a bit bigger, and this time he thought it was about 300 feet over the trees by his estimation, and it was alternating between red, green, and yellow. It appeared almost liquid-like, they said too, like it had no distinct form. Jim described it as almost looking like some sort of miniature sun, and that it got so close that he thought if he had a rock handy, he could actually throw it at the craft and bounce it off of its side. Whatever this was, it got a lot closer than when they saw it before. Beyond this, it was totally silent though, and as it glowed brighter, it began to light up the whole forest. Chuck, though, would then say duck after he grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the object, flashing an SOS signal at it. And in response, it would begin to emit a sort of searchlight that was scanning the water, moving towards them. This quickly went from a chill night on the water to a poop your pants kind of moment. Thus, they frantically paddled towards camp, and things got weirdly hazy, but they thought nothing of it, as the next thing they knew, they were paddling up towards shore. Now remember, just before this, they'd made a huge fire. That said, this large fire, which they'd only left unattended for what they thought was about 20 minutes, was odd. By their account, it was reduced to embers, indicating that quite a bit more time had passed. Now, that alone is strange, but that wasn't it. Further, they all sort of remarked they felt weird, sort of like, how you feel after surgery due to anesthesia. Like they were conscious, but they felt sort of off. But hey, what were they going to do about it? They were out in the Allagash wilderness, so they sort of shrugged this off, and they'd actually go to bed and have a normal rest of their night. Now, I don't know if I'd be able to have a normal rest of my night if I got chased by a UFO searchlight, but hey, they did. Now, despite the night seemingly ending normally, they didn't forget about this experience immediately. The next day, they actually ran into a ranger, and they asked him about what they saw, and he thought perhaps it could have been spotlights from a new hardware store that opened in Millinocket that had just opened up. But Millinocket was like 70 miles away, so this didn't exactly fit the bill. This was all they thought about it. They thanked the ranger, but they knew this wasn't what they saw, and, well, after this, their trip went on, and from all accounts, it went normally for their remaining 10 or so days in the Allagash wilderness, and therefore, like many of us that have a weird experience, the experience was left behind and the kids went on with their lives without a hitch. That is until about 1988. See, around this time, Jim Weiner was having a weird time. He was having nightmares, during which he admitted he felt like he was awake, like he was experiencing sleep paralysis. And in these dreams, he could only move his eyes, but he felt so hazy he didn't quite believe it was reality. In these dreams, or whatever they were, Jim would wake up feeling like he wasn't alone, and he'd hear voices speaking in a manner that he couldn't quite understand. Further, after a few of these dreams, he'd realize he wasn't alone in them. In them, he'd see his brother Jack and his friends Chuck and Charlie, all of the men who were on the camping trip a decade prior. Here, the men would be inside of a bright white room, and they'd all be naked like a Norwegian sauna with a side of extra sausage. Now, Jim, it's worth noting, didn't initially interpret this as alien abduction. He actually thought it was related to trauma from an accident that he'd been in years earlier. He'd been in an accident where he injured his spine and his brainstem, and he even talked to his psychiatrist about this, and she seemed to think it was reasonable that this might be related. Further, at least for a while, the dreams were becoming less frequent, so he thought he was getting better. Well, that is until Jim talked to his brother Jack about these dreams, and his jaw would drop, because he'd remark he was having them too. Then, with some inclinations here, they reached out to Chuck and Charlie, and wouldn't you know it, they were also having these dreams. I have to imagine this conversation was pretty funny. Hey, how have you been? Have you and your wife had kids? Did you go to the zoo lately? Have you been waking up in the middle of the night in a bright room surrounded by us, followed by having a strangely sore butt in the morning? Regardless of how it went, though, this was a shared experience between all of them. And then, this is weird to me, some stories say that Jim's doctor actually referred this group to see a ufologist, though others say that he contacted a UFO researcher, Ray Fowler, for help himself, and he's the one that recommended regression hypnotherapy. Either way you slice it, though, they went down the hypnosis road. Now, all four men here would undergo hypnosis separately, and while they were doing this, they supposedly uncovered eerily similar experiences of memories they supposedly otherwise couldn't access from this past event. They all recalled being aboard some sort of strange craft back in the 1970s, when they were in the wilderness together, and while here, they had examinations, let's say, from creatures which they described as being slim, having large heads, dark eyes, and who, rather than speaking with mouths, would telepathically send messages to them. And remember, back in the 70s when they were camping, they arrived back at their campsite to find their recently roaring fire was reduced to embers, consistent with a massive amount of time lost. An amount of time they thought that might have been spent aboard some craft. Thus, they thought they'd been abducted, and they decided they wanted to start talking about it. Soon after releasing their story, they began going together on speaking circuits, talking at UFO-adjacent conferences, and over time, they became known as the Allagash 4, I guess the UFO version of the Jonas Brothers. But all was not hunky-dory. I don't know the exact circumstances of this, but at some point, Chuck, one of the four, would come forward and essentially say that some of this alien mumbo-jumbo was just that, mumbo-jumbo. It was made up. In an interview, he'd literally say that he only supported the story to make money. Now, to be clear, as for the strange incident with the light they saw while looking for the lost camper, and I think the strange light they saw while paddling, that, he said, was true to a point, though I get the sense that the searchlight part was probably bogus. Further, he really did see this craft changing color from white to red to green in a liquid kind of melding motion. He even really did undergo hypnosis, but he admits that this hypnosis didn't lead him to recall anything fantastical like he previously claimed, and the abduction part was entirely fabricated. In short, in his words, he claimed this was pretty much a hoax. Meanwhile, the others in the group started claiming that the only reason he was saying this was false was that the group had a falling out after years of going on television programs and attending conferences together. And I hate to leave it off on a cliffhanger, but that's sort of how the story ends. So the question is, what do you believe? Maybe you've had a strange experience on your own while in the wilderness of Maine that mirrors this, and you support them. Or possibly you're in the camp of thinking this was a star mixed with some fun inversion phenomena in the atmosphere. Either way, let me know what you think. Alfred, Maine is a small town about 15 miles east of the Maine border and a little bit northwest of Kennebunkport. And I don't mean anything ill by this, but like many towns in Maine, it's small, even in modern day, with a population of only about 3,000. But what this small town does have that many towns don't is a plaque that states, "Site of the Slaying of Elephant, exhibited by Hacaliah Bailey and George Brown Company of Somers, New York, July 24th, 1816, which, given this is Maine and not Africa or Asia, is a stark indication that here in 1816 was an ending to a very interesting story, a story of an elephant named Old Bet. Now, depending upon who's telling this story, the specific detail varies, but Old Bet, it's well established, was either the first or second elephant ever to enter the USA, with most stories saying she was number 2. This elephant that would come to be named Old Bet would first be mentioned in a publication from Greenleaf, New York, noting that an elephant journeyed to the USA aboard a ship named America. The journey would begin when the elephant was bought by an Englishman and former sea captain named Stephen Price, in what most think was modern-day Sri Lanka. He purchased her hoping to capitalize on the public's recent fascination with exotic animals at the time. The elephant would ultimately arrive in Boston on April 13th of 1796, where she'd be showcased at local fairs and gatherings, billing her as, I quote, "a wonder of the world," and showing off tricks like kneeling and lifting up objects. That said, most sources indicate that Price began to struggle financially around 1801, possibly due to the high costs of caring for an element and keeping her fresh in the public eye. And as luck would have it, he'd find someone willing to purchase her from him. The story goes that in 1801, Hacaliah Bailey, a farmer from Somers, New York, who frequently visited the New York City area to have his cattle sold to slaughter, was attending a tavern named the Bull's Head Tavern, near where this slaughter activity occurred, a spot known to be frequented by ship captains and businessmen as they passed through. Here, Bailey was known to gossip, drink, and network, whatever that meant for an early 19th century farmer. He probably wasn't adding people on LinkedIn here, though, if I had to guess. That said, after consuming his fill of grog, the story goes he walked outside, probably hammered, and in front of the other livestock there was a large gray beast unlike he'd ever seen, an elephant, fresh off the boat, and he'd been enamored. Now, the details on what happened next are kind of murky at best, but they say this old elephant was sold to Bailey today for $1,200, or nearly $30,000 in modern day, and that Bailey first intended for Old Bet to be used as a farm animal in Somers, New York. But then Bailey noticed something. His neighbors were really interested in this elephant. So interested that Bailey found he could charge people money to just look at this beast of burden. And not so long later, he was charging 25 cents to $1, depending on where he was, for people all over New England to take a look at his exotic pet. Thus, he would shuttle this elephant around, moving her on his sloop that he previously used to transport livestock, and moving her overnight so she wasn't seen by the prying eyes of locals. And this gig he decided on pursuing, it worked very, very well, as this was a time, as I noted, when most Americans had never seen an elephant before. Thus, by 1808, she was so profitable that he partnered with Benjamin Lint and Andrew Brunn, who paid Bailey $1,200 for an equal 2/3 share of Old Bet to him. And after that, he'd start traveling the broader region with her, taking her here and there on his sloop, giving rise to a show you might have heard of, Bailey's Traveling Show and Menagerie, a precursor to something you're probably even more likely to have heard of, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Yep, he was the Bailey in that circus. Now, circuses did exist prior to this, but having an elephant on display was new, and under this circus's direction, Old Bet would go everywhere from Georgia to Maine. That said, sadly, as you know on this channel, stories involving animals that are used in show, or unique ones really, rarely end happily here. Thus, in 1816, on July 26th, while Bailey was parading poor Old Bet around in Alfred, Maine, a local farmer named Daniel Davis would literally assassinate her right there, shooting her on the streets of rural Maine, with his motivation being jealousy and being angry that poor farmers were being charged to see an elephant. The story goes that Old Bet was so big, it wouldn't make sense to transport her large body back to New York. So instead, she was buried right here in Alfred, Maine, and a plaque that remains here today was put up in her honor, marking the spot where, as far as I can tell, the only elephant was ever assassinated in North America. So congratulations, Maine. Keep that accolade in your pocket for a rainy day. Anyhow, to this day, this plaque remains. That said, 13 years after this, Old Bet's remains were dug up, and her bones were mounted in the Scudder's American Museum in New York, where in this elephant's honor, a hotel was built in 1820 by Bailey, named the Elephant Hotel. Maniacs, it's been great seeing you all again, and I hope I did some of your weird folklore justice. Now if you want to see more videos like this, it's easy. Just like this video, comment, and subscribe. When I make a Maine video and a bunch of people do this, it tells me I should make more Maine videos, because people love them, and 2, it tells YouTube I'm alright. The early comments, so if you want to say hi, I'll say hi back. Beyond this, next up, I think I'm going to briefly move on to New York State to cover some of its strange folklore, or maybe New York City, but I'm going to cover both of them soon. And with this in mind, whether you just saw a werewolf out of your window, or if you're sad because your grandpa's tombstone got a weird imprint of a leg on it, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.